Check, check. Okay. I think everything is good to go. Hello, everybody. It's Patrick Kenny. I'm the online coordinator of the School of Game Development. I'm also an instructor. I help with the course development, overseeing a lot of the courses getting developed. And I just have been visiting you every Friday with this webcast to discuss one particular aspect or another of some of our game development processes. I'm kind of focusing on a lot of the transitions between UDK and Unreal 4. I'm going to focus on a lot of different things as we get a little bit more comfortable with these. We'll start getting into more specific content with modeling, with painting textures. I'm going to do a little bit of texture painting today just to indicate some basic principles for you. But last week there was a request to talk about something to do with texel density, texture scaling, basically, and I also wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about the metallic roughness setup that goes on in Unreal. So I'm going to save this scene out. I believe I've got this saved. I'm going to back off. I'm going to come back to this when we're talking about roughness and the metallic properties, but I wanted to talk about a couple things. First, when it comes to scaling, back in the days of UDK, the scales that you would use between your objects and what went on in the Unreal Development Kit were somewhat convoluted. I mean, they worked because everybody got used to them and everything was fine, but they weren't very consistent with real-world scaling. They were proportional. And now in Unity 5 and Unreal, everything is pretty much proportional. So if you're working to centimeters, which is usually the default in Maya, you're going to be working to a proportional unit in Unreal. So an Unreal unit equals a centimeter. So should we work to real world units in in Maya? And the answer isn't always yes, just because working in real world units can sometimes get a little bit huge for your camera. But I've got my grid set up a certain way, and I'll just show you. I went into my grid settings, and I set it up to a length and width of 100 units, grid lines every unit, and a subdivision every unit. If I bounce back over to Unreal, and I'm hoping I have this saved, I'm going to delete this for just a second, and I'm going to bring this back up. Go over to my player start. What you're seeing is just a cube that I created in Maya that's essentially 180 centimeters tall and about 60 centimeters wide and deep. And what I always recommend is whenever you're working, work to whatever the scale of one of your average characters would be. Yes, there's definitely a way to create world setups and things like that. I'm going to talk about that in just a sec. But I always say, well, whatever your hero is going to be, go ahead and create something relative to that, and that should start to establish the scale for things. There are some kind of standards for Unreal, but my boss, a experienced designer, Charlie Hunegard, briefed me on this, and this is stuff that I remember from when we were working at the studios, is that usually scale is relative to a particular game. Yes, engines do have some standard scale conventions, but to work inside of Unreal to its scale conventions is perfectly normal. But you got to know that the characters that they have set up in there, they jump really far, and sometimes, and the speed isn't necessarily what you want all the time. So the scale is going to change, but just to let you know, for the default setup of Unreal, something that's 180 units tall is approximately 6 feet, and it's, you can work to that scale. You can work a little bit differently. 60 in the width and the depth is about fine. 72 sometimes is used as well. There are some standard units for ceilings. Usually 300 Unreal units is somewhere around just under 10 feet, a little bit like 9.8 feet. And then 400 Unreal units is another standard that's been used. That's more around a 13-foot ceiling. There are tons of different scaling conventions that you can use. There's some standardized stuff that I can share. I know I've got some links to that. I can attach them to this post. But anyway, working to this size, 180 centimeters tall, 60 in X and Z, that should be a good enough, at least X and Z in Maya. Z is up in Unreal. So that's one thing about just general scale. Now, the question was specifically asked, I think, last week about texel density in terms of, let's see if I can find my scene. In terms of, there we go. How big should you map a texture for a particular size of a polygon? And this is something that you always need to establish as you get started in any sort of game. It's usually created at the outset to say, okay, for every so many feet or for every so many units, this is what we're going to use. I'm going to move in on some of these. Now what I did was I took this basic kind of orange stone wall texture that I found online, and I just scaled it down to a 64 texture, a 128, a 256, a 512, and a 1024. And for the 2048, I simply tiled the 1024. It's not proportional anymore. It's just basically tiled 2 times each direction. So this is 8 units, and so 8 units is about a 64-bit pixel texture, 64 pixel texture. And going to 16, we get up to 128, 256, 512, etc., etc. It's a pretty standard kind of measurement in Unreal, and all you need to think about is that if here in the Western world, we're more accustomed to working in feet. So if you just basically guesstimate that a foot is equal to 30 centimeters, and that's pretty much a good way of looking at it. So when you set up your units, if you have modular units that you're setting up, corridors, corners, and things like that, anything to do with a city block, storefronts, you can kind of think that, like, well, 30 units is going to be equal to 1 foot. So, and those are conventions that are based off of stuff in the Unreal Tournament. And does it change? Of course it changes. I was just speaking to Charlie Hernegard, and he reminded me that for every game there's something that's called a danger room that's created, and it's where the designers basically are testing out the physics, but they're also creating sort of the ideal dimensions for ramps, for stairs, inclines, curved surfaces, to basically see what's comfortable for the player to navigate through in terms of space. Those objects are created as placeholders, and then they're usually passed on to the artist once a lot of the level prototypes are starting to get developed. So I would say when it comes to Unreal, there's a lot of advances, and to answer a question, what's a good texture resolution to work at? I always say the bigger the better. I know some people might not agree with me, but if you're trying to go for something that's middle of the road, it's easier to go down and lose information than it is to go up. You really can't. There's only so much texture information. So an ideal texture size that I usually work at is 2048. There are a lot of textures that you'll find in downloadable artwork that are 4096. That's pretty big. Not to say it isn't used, but it's used mostly in certain textures just because they can create maps, which are scalable, compressed maps that go down in size, that make it easy for the processor once you back away from a certain building to take the image down to a lower resolution. But 2048 pixels square is what I would recommend for a texture, at least to work at that. If you're doing characters, 4096 is probably good if you're doing something higher resolution, and then scaling it down. Again, it's just that principle that goes just the same with printing something in real life. You can, a lot of artists will work a size and a half to 2 times up. So do the same thing, more pixel information. You can always bring it down and adjust things in your layers as you go. So there's a little bit of a working convention with texel density. And again, the term texel density, texel is just a polyglot. It's like pixel, is picture element. Texture is texture element. And a lot of times it's called texture density, texture scale, but you've probably seen bad examples of it in mods and things like that, when people are just slapping textures of any size, any proportion onto things, and they're not tiling them correctly, and they're not making them proportional to other textures. So once you start up with yours, when you get started with a project, using some sort of metric like this will allow you to bring them down pretty easily. So enough of that. Let me go back to the panel that I had. Okay, this is a little simple panel that I had created as a quick normal, quick and dirty normal map for a class. This is the high resolution one. The low resolution one is somewhere hiding behind it. And I don't believe that there's a texture on it right now. Yeah, somehow I think the normal map got thrown on there. Hang on just a sec. Oh, and I did a really quick normal bake on this. It looks like it's not coming out the way I wanted it to. Give me just a second, and I'm going to bring up a different one. Let's see what's going on here. Looks like it flipped it inside out. Stand by. The joys of live streaming. Go ahead and assign a brand new shader to this. this out of the way because I've got this in Unreal. Sorry about that. So yeah, I just modeled something really simple, and then I put a normal map onto the low resolution version. Nothing too complicated, just through a straight ahead texture bake. But what I wanted to talk about was the roughness metallic process that goes on in Unreal, because it's, this is something that I talked about a little bit last week, but I kind of glossed over. Sorry, bad pun. I just glossed over the sort of the idea behind it. And one of the basic principles of it is that you're talking about the difference between metallic and non-metallic surfaces. And it's a really simple distinction between the two. So if something is metallic, it's going to have a metallic property to it. It's going to have some sort of input or map that is in the metallic channel. If it doesn't, you don't need to worry about it. So what is metallic? What isn't metallic? Well, just about everything can, that's metallic is going to be metal, but you're not always going to want things to be very perfectly shiny and things like that. And that's where the roughness map comes in. And the way you got to think about the roughness map is kind of like a chronicle of the wear and tear and the aging and the sort of the beating that a surface is taken, because that diffuses a lot of the specularity. So just to back it up a sec, go ahead and hide these real quick. I've got like this little blue light going on in here. Go ahead and delete that. So if I go ahead and create a Phong material, before the days of physically based rendering, you essentially had this was kind of like your shading model, and the Phong in Maya is essentially, it's a little bit of this two-channel hack between what is the strength of something, and I'll bring the cosine power down to show you something, and the specularity, that is the brightness of something, which is what we would put in a specular map, and then this cosine power, which can also be called the eccentricity, which spreads out. So in real life, what happens is that the tighter that something gets, usually the stronger the specular color is, but whereas the lighter it gets, or the darker it gets, the more diffused it gets. And I say diffused because light is sort of bouncing off, at these erratic angles. And so if you look in the specular shading of a Phong shader and you look at the cosine power and the specular power, those two things, should be working with one another. You can adjust them in the old Phong shader, and what the PBR shaders do is they do both of those automatically. So if something is, diffused like this, it's not going to have a strong specular power. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be down like that. So the way to think about it is, these things will work together, and the roughness map really helps bring a lot of that together. So if something is metallic or not, yes, you can create transitions and things like that, but it's mostly the roughness map that's going to control a lot of that what's called microsurface diffusion of light. And a lot of times you'll see let me just find myself a medium gray and back that off and do some quick drawing for you. What you'll mostly see illustrations of is if a surface is like this and light's coming in, well, it's not just going to bounce off at an equal angle, it's going to go this way, and it even goes below the surface to a certain degree and bounces all over the place. So if it's a perfectly reflective surface, Sorry about the clicks. You know, you're going to get lights, that array of light that comes in like this. That angle of incidence and the angle of reflection is usually going to, you know, be pretty equal. That's with reflective surfaces. That's you know, most surfaces aren't like that. Most of them have they're somewhere in between this and this. And that roughness really helps read a lot of that. It works in concert with the normal map, it works in concert with the height map, things along those lines. So let me go back into Unreal and I can delete this. And I'll just go ahead and rotate this around. And I'll scale it up a little bit. And that panel that I had, which is right here. Ooh, I don't want to make it that big. You know, I could go ahead and mess with my light source if I wanted to, or something along those lines. But this is essentially that normal map that I had created from the object in Maya, applied it to this. It's on a flat plane, and I just wanted to get something established to start to explain the whole metallic and roughness principles, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some vector parameters on this material, and then I'm going to go into Photoshop and I'm going to start painting on them and replace those vector parameters with actual textures. So, you know, if you want to stick around and watch me do this for a little bit, it's fine. I'll try to, you know, do this as quick and dirty as possible, not to, you know, complicate the issue or get too into the nitty gritty, because it's better to, when you're explaining these things, basically to explain it on a very simple thing. So let's go into the material for this, and I call this M panel. And remember, it's usually a good habit to get consistent naming conventions with everything. Capital M underscore is usually a good naming convention for materials. Static meshes are SM underscore, textures are T underscore, and then whatever the texture is at the end defines what type of texture it is. So you can see on this, I've just got a vector parameter that's somewhere around white. It's a really light white, light gray, excuse me. And then I've got my normal map and normal input. So let's just go ahead, and I'm not even going to bother with a vector parameter. I'm just going to hold 1 and left click and attach it into the metallic input, and I'm going to 1 input, and I'm going to attach it to the roughness. So for this value, I'm going to make it 1, so it is metallic. And hopefully this updates relatively quickly. Yeah, so let's go ahead and maximize this. And of course, if it has no roughness, if that's at 0 and our metallic is at 1, we are talking about something that is a mirrored surface. It has no roughness, it is smooth as glass, and it is perfectly metallic. And when you're doing really quick and dirty setups on your materials, these are good starters. They're fine just to create inputs, especially if you want to just make basic notations of, okay, this is going to be metallic. Well, you can go ahead and add this at 0.5 and update this. I'm going to show you a little bit of a little handy guide as well in just a second as we're developing these. Need some traveling music for this. Alright, so I'll just go ahead and move this off to the side for a second. So we start to get something that's a little bit more, let's move the player start. Again, not perfectly reflective, and because this is reflective, I would want to bring a sphere reflection capture, and a sphere reflection capture actor is essentially this spherical volume that you want to bring in the proximity. You can see it covers a certain range, and you'd want to bring it in the range of this. I'd probably want to add a light mass importance, because the light mass essentially is what's calculating a lot of the bounced rays, and that needs to be scaled to the size of your interior or your environment, something along those lines. There's really not a lot to just gonna go ahead and attach that to that right now. And let's check that out. And again, this stuff is, sometimes you have to talk a little bit about lighting as you're talking about these materials, because with the physically based setup, that's the whole point of doing this. You're getting stuff that's more based in a physically realistic kind of setting. That's why it looks so realistic. I think I did something wrong to this. Wondering if my normal map's not taking. Hang on just a sec. Love it when I try to explain something and it all goes wrong. Let's go ahead and nothing there. There we go. I'm gonna go ahead and cancel the light build just so I can hang on to this material. But anyway, sorry about the delay there, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to start to talk about how you can get roughness maps created to start to input into your material. And so to do that, I wanted to bounce back over to Photoshop, and we don't need that just for now. And what I've done is I've created some duplicates of this normal map, and one of them is in a roughness group, and I'm just going to kind of use this as a reference. And I mean, I'm going to pull this saturation out of here real quick and turn off the metallic real fast, because I'll get around to that in just a sec. I only want to use this as just a quick reference because it's just a flat plane right now. There really isn't any place to show a reference to paint anything, because the one thing that I do notice when beginner students are starting to apply maps onto objects is that they're not being very discriminate about where they put a lot of the roughness, And imagine if these were like access panels or something like that. Where would, along something that was metallic, where would a lot of the roughness start to occur? It would occur around the places where technicians might be handling them many times. That's also where the dirt's going to be. It's probably going to be where some of the corrosion is going to occur. And those are, pretty important things to look at. So I'm going to kind of pull in. Now these are actually cement grunge maps, but I'm gonna grab a big sample of this. Grab something a little bit bigger because I'm just gonna. This is definitely like one way to start to create a lot of this. And this is a really quick and dirty fix. But if you wanted to, you could have just like a general sense of roughness and spottiness, things like that. Or you could go in and specifically start to add it in certain areas. And if I was going to add it just using this, and again, just doing this pretty, quickly, without setting up too many masks and things like that, I'd probably end up using either something like the spot healing. Probably end up using the clone stamp tool and then I'd grab a brush that was a little more broken up. I'm not even going to bother with any brush parameters or anything like that. So what I want to do is I'm going to set this up. I've got this map here. Temporarily move this out of here. I'm just gonna bring this in as a reference. Alright, so what I'm doing is I'm just keeping this as some sort of really light template on top of here. So you can go into your color picker and you can end up, you could take a clone stamp and clone some of the image. I'm going to do that, but what I'm also going to do is just kind of block in some color. Actually, let's go ahead and get that on the brush. Excuse me. There we go. We'll come back to the clone stamp in just a second. Bring the flow down. And I'll just make this relatively quick and dirty for the sake of not boring you guys with 8 steps of painting. About the police sirens. what I'm doing, I mean, in this pretty haphazard way, is I'm just creating some really quick changes in the way that this surface is set up in terms of the wear and things like that. And I know it's not too pretty looking, but that's okay. And if you thought I was just about done, I'm gonna add a big old handprint to it. Let's do that and something along those lines. All right, I'm going to come back to that because it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit about roughness and how it works. Now, I think I mentioned this last week, is that with glossiness map, which was basically that size of the eccentricity, which I showed in that Phong shader in Maya, if it was going to be lighter, it was going to be glossier. Well, with a roughness map, it's inverted. So roughness is the lighter it goes. So that means it's going to diffuse more light. It's not going to be as purely reflective on a metallic surface. So you need to keep that in mind as you're setting this up. So if you want to, you can go in with some levels and make an adjustment layer to this. And again, I'm going to be taking a lot of the normal map that I use as a reference down. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go into a medium gray and just fill it in like that. Some quick. All right. So anything that is going to be darker is not going to be rough, it's going to be shiny. Anything that is lighter is going to be rougher. Again, this is a pretty ugly example, but we can get the idea. And the more I want to work on this, the more specific I could bring it into these areas. So maybe I want to make some of these areas around the edges, as I keep making iterations, shinier. You know, because then maybe they'll be worn away. There's no grime and corrosion or anything like that on them. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this real quick. And I'm just going to give it a name of panel underscore R. Don't really need to be 32 bits, but I'm going to save it like that. And we can import it in. And I'll bring this over here. And I'll just drag it in. And I'm going to input it and apply it and save it. In just a second, I'm going to show you, I'm going to take apart a few pre-made assets. Now the reason that you're seeing, there's something, you're definitely seeing it, but because the metallic value is so metallic, it's purely 100%, is that we're seeing some of this. Let me bring this around. And I'll expand this because this will be better for the folks watching at home. Because you can start to see it. And what I'm going to do is bring this level down about 20%. Because a lot of times people will just use the metallic input as, well, it's either metallic or it's not metallic. And there are transitional areas that you can use, but I do recommend that for the most part you use it to designate, you know, the areas that are metal and the areas that aren't. Especially as game artists, you can see the difference. It's kind of leaning back towards this really light surface. It's still giving some reflection. But the problem is we kind of lose the roughness at that point. So what's important to know is what color, in terms of a local color, do we want this to be? Something that's white or almost white is basically going to be, you know, purely reflective if it's at 1. And that's probably not what we want. We want something that's going to be a bit darker. And what we really want to do is end up painting a map. And I'm going to bounce over to the chat box to see if anybody is... And what we really want to do is end up painting a map. Okay. Just waiting for this to save. I've got everything open and my computer is probably complaining now. And I'm going to bounce over to the chat box to see if anybody is... And what we really want to do is end up painting a map. Okay. Just waiting for this to save. If anybody has any questions right now and you want to type them in the chat box, they can be kind of general knowledge questions, things like that. Feel free. This is taking me a while to update. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into Photoshop and I'm going to start painting more of a diffuse texture for this, and I'm going to borrow some of the attributes of the roughness map for it. And I'll duplicate the normal group and I'll just call it diffuse. I'm going to go back into Photoshop and I'm going to start painting more of the diffuse texture for this. And I'm going to borrow some of the All right. Turn that off. Turn that off. These are all. These groups are. Hang on just a second. Okay, Angela, I'm sorry. I was just wrestling with my my groups and my channels. Apologies. Angela, you're asking if you're wondering if there's a way to adjust the strength of the normal map in the editor. Are you referring to the anything in Photoshop, or are you referring to the material editor? Because there is a way to, as the short answer is, there's a way to do it in both, and I'll bring it back in here. Angela, you're asking if you're wondering if there's a way to adjust the strength of. Let me see if I can answer your question in here. I'm going to kill this, and we'll apply this. Something to remember about a normal map is that the base value for it is a really saturated blue. I think I and yeah, the material. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting this stuff on a delay, trying to get things to work simultaneously. I apologize. The normal map can be adjusted in the material panel. Pretty much anything can. You can pass it through some math nodes, but you have to sort of combine it with something, right? And the thing that you would want to combine it with is a vector parameter, and you'd want to call it, you'd want to give it some values of 128, 128, and 255, because that color, 128 red, 128 green, and 255 in blue, and yeah, it's giving me like some big, is basically like a zero value for a normal map. Let me go ahead and minimize this. And you'd probably want to pass this through a either a lerp, or you'd want to pass it through a multiply. Although a multiply really wouldn't. What is it? Do I have that wrong? I think I've got that wrong. Hang on just a second. Let me get this in Photoshop. Yeah. 128, 128, and 255. I'll show this to you in Photoshop and see if I can get this established in Unreal. This is kind of like a zero value for a normal map. So if you had a normal map like this, and you pasted it in, it would be possible just through layer blending to decrease the strength of it. So that would help you decrease the strength of it. The thing that you have to remember is that it's usually good to, because this is sort of blending with this level on this layer, you've got two different pixels sort of overlapping one another. And I don't know if you've taken the classes yet, but that have it, I know that there are some grad classes, but also the texture and light classes may talk about this. But XNormal has some nice filters to help sort of straighten out all of the channels of this. The thing that's important to remember when you're starting to do like normal map blending on anything is that when you establish the background as your base normal map and that you create this overlap like this, you want to go into the double click and go on the layer style, and you want to uncheck the blue channel, because you want the background blue channel to be affecting it, because the blue is essentially the forward backward tangent channel and or normal, and we want to basically have this be affected by everything, not in terms of the up and down and the side to side. The background should be R, G, and B, but this one and anything else that you overlap it with, you want to basically take out the blue channel. So that's how you can help blend it together, and then you can start to bring this down. But the last thing that I usually do, and this is a filter that I was talking about called through XNormal, is you can normalize the normal map. And what that does is it helps just keep the values, the pixel values that are on here, from going over 255, because if you overdrive the value, you're not going to get an accurate, you might get some normal map issues in terms of the way it looks in game. And yeah, that's a little bit of a trick in terms of that. In getting it to work in Unreal, it's a similar kind of setup. I'm forgetting something basic right now, why this is doing this for me. But I would bring that in. It looks like it's doing it. Oh, feel free to say okay. And these, you could pass both of them through a lerp. You'd want to create something, I think it would be something a little bit more along the lines of, not necessarily an additive, but something that added these two together, but then you'd have to clamp it. I will get back to you on that, because I was going to talk a little bit next week about combining normal maps for different reasons. And I know that you can combine things, but the problem is the same thing that goes on with these pixel values is that they basically can overdrive 255 pixels. So I'll get back to you on that one, because there's a fix, but I can't seem to remember it right now of how that gets put together. The Photoshop way is usually a way that you can kind of dull it down. Let me get back to this big mess that I was working on here, because what I'm going to do to this is I'm going to just desaturate this whole thing. kind of use it as a template for a different map. It is, I'm just looking at the chat box, it's easier to adjust it in Photoshop. It takes a little bit more doing to set it up in terms of nodes, but I would always recommend that when you're extracting a normal map to get as much as you can out of that normal map, and don't really try to overdrive it that much when you get into Unreal if you do end up, you know, multiplying it with something else, because you want to make sure that those values are clamped. The pixel values are clamped to 255. You do not want to you know, overdrive it. So combining them, and that happens a lot, because with exploded bakes, if you were doing, you know, something that had like lots of conjoined surfaces, interpenetrating surfaces, and you wanted to do an exploded bake where you were basically exploding everything out a few units and then baking it separately before you brought it back together, sometimes you have to composite those things together. They don't they need to be composited onto one Photoshop document, and for that reason you're going to need to set it up that way. So let me make some shapes here. It's just gonna, what we got here? So I'm just gonna do some shape operations and some other types of operations to create some graphics on here. And let's put let's fill it with just going ahead and making some basic shapes in here. I'm just going to duplicate them. And let's just bring these down. So what I'm doing is just making some basic decal information, things like that. Because what I want to do is I want to make these non-metallic, and I want to, you know, start to create the template for that. So what I end up doing is take that and duplicate it. And pull it outside of this. Bring it up here. And I'm going to remember these. Show you really quickly what you can do fill these with white, and that's going to be my basic metallic map. And then so I'm going to go ahead and save that out. That. Turn that off. And then I'm going to create some sort of base color for this. Going to be too beautiful, but that's okay. And this one we're going to call, this is going to be our diffuse or albedo. I use an _D. It's the old sort of naming convention for it, since they're considered albedo textures. Diffuse or albedo usually works. And then I'm going to go back into here. And I'm going to import a few more assets in here. So there's the diffuse, there's the metallic. Sorry, not enough windows in here. I'll go ahead and bring this into here. And I'll bring this into here. Expand this just so it doesn't get so confusing. Roughness, there's our metallic. And again, if you don't see them update in here, you can always see them down in here because it'll show you what the texture is. And I'm going to hold Alt to detach that, delete it. Go ahead and delete that. That'll be our base color. And right after I get this all hooked in and see the results, I'll talk a little bit about it, and then I'll bring up some other assets and talk a little bit about the way that their materials are set up. So still way too metallic, but something I wanted to, and I'm gonna go into the roughness map and make some adjustments to it. But something that you can see in the diffuse map or the color map is that it is not metallic at all. And that's because of this map that we had created really quick in Photoshop. And it's basically just saying that's going to be metallic, that's not going to be metallic. So you can do this on surfaces, say if you're doing an axe that has a wooden handle. You know, the handle part of the texture map can be black and the axe part can be white. And then you can have as you know, really grimy an edge as you want to get some nice dirtiness out of it. Let me go into the material editor real quick. to try to fix this real quick with let's see if we can see if I can multiply this. Probably should try to clamp this, but and what I just did there was I just added a multiply node, and I'm just going to take whatever I have and I'm going to try to pump it up, because with the multiply node you're multiplying whatever the value is in the RG and B channels by whatever the factor is in the B channel, and I made it 1.2. If you multiply it by 1, you're just going to get the same result. If you multiply it by a decimal value, you'll get a darker result. If you multiply it by something over 1, you're going to get something that's going to be overdriven, but you kind of do that at your own peril, because it's definitely increasing the roughness of it. It's pushing it just a bit more. What I really need to do is incorporate a different type of diffuse texture, refine this map a little bit more, and maybe even bring down some of the values in the metallic map so that things aren't so purely reflective. Because it's outside right now. There's if it was inside, it would be reflecting an interior environment. It wouldn't look so like super metallic. Let me go into the starter content. I highly recommend that you keep a project and you go through some of the starter content and you take a look at the way that some of these have been set up, because they can be useful. Some of these things that they look like plumber's nightmares in terms of the way that some of these things are set up. I would not get so intimidated by the way that they're setting up some of the patterns in these, because what they're doing is they're setting up these noise textures to start to create some randomness across different channels, and it's basically just their way of getting like this big kind of setup so that you can interactively adjust things on the fly. And again, it can be really sort of confusing. I would say take a look at them, but don't freezing up on me here. Hang on a sec. All right, there we go. The gold is a pretty good one to look at. It's all of the metallic ones have these 3-channel macros that they're plugging different values from these texture samples into. It always looks complicated because they're multiplying it, they're using it for different parts of the channels. It's almost like they're starting to use single channel information that they're multiplying through other objects or other nodes rather, to get different results for things. We will be teaching classes that talk a lot more about these things. I would just say take a look at the ones that are a little bit simpler, and sometimes it's just something like the wooden ones. I would also invite you to get this thing back up here. And even these can be a little bit on the rough side, but what you're seeing up here are basically these texture patterns that they're taking each one of these in terms of, this is just a texture coordinate node, and they're pushing it through this to to get the texture coordinates to match on all these, and they're just taking it through this add node so they can then multiply those values, interpolating it. That's all going into the base color, and it's just getting combined with this. So it's more math than it is anything else, and as artists, you know, the deeper you get into this, the more you'll be able to set stuff up like this. But this is really useful when you've got like large expanses of assets and things like that you're going to do like really different things to. I would recommend, you know, trying to stick to your textures, making things as straightforward as you can. The simpler you make it, the easier it is to figure out. I just was going to show you. Let's see. Just wanted to bring in some of the Firelands static mesh from Infinity Blade. You know, again, this stuff is, you know, been finely made. Get rid of this thing. But if you're taking a look at something that's, a lot of these are just stone, or they're metal, or they're stone, and they've got a little bit of a couple other different surfaces to them. But if you look at them in wireframe, you know, you're going to see a lot of things about them. If you take a look at the orange stuff, it's going to be all triangulated, going to be pretty, you know, low poly. If you let's take a look at this. Looks like it's got the Grim statue on here. That's the static mesh editor. So if we go into the static meshes, there's that. There's the Grim statue. So a lot simpler. And eventually these textures will come up. Sorry about this, my machine is really slow right now. And again, a lot of these textures have been made as assets in you know, some either ZBrush or Mudbox or some sort of digital sculpting package, and then they've been baked onto low-res models. But the only thing that's different about a lot of these is that they basically just pass the red channel, which is essentially a grayscale, as the alpha of this linear interpolation. And all the linear interpolation is doing is setting a range between something. And what it's doing, and what these are doing, is it's saying, okay, between 85 and 98%, those between that range, it's using this source to control the roughness. That's really all it is, because remember, a lerp is just going in between one. It's acting as a mask if it's fully masked off with the alpha, but it's really just this kind of linear range, and you're sort of prescribing what that range is. Usually it's 0 to 1, or it's, you know, whatever input is A is to input B. But it's just using what's ever in here, which is this painted map. All right. So definitely take a look at those. Take a look. Ask me a question about it. I usually can figure it out, and a lot of times it's just based off the source texture, those lines. I myself am, you know, really starting to get into a lot of the development of the multi-channel hookups and things like that. And the more that we talk about this stuff, the more I'm gonna, you know, I'll show you some different examples. I'll show you some, you know, probably some better prepared stuff, some things where the examples are a little bit more sophisticated as we ramp up into these videos. But if anybody is still hanging on and you want to ask me a question, go right ahead, and I'll hang on the line for a couple minutes. But I think, to summarize, and I probably took a while to get around to the point, is that the relationship in Unreal 4 between the roughness map and the metallic map is pretty much what you're looking for if you're trying to develop anything that is any rough sort of metal to any refined sort of metal to ancient hand welded, hand forged stuff. But I think the thing to understand is that it's like a relationship not just between the roughness map and whether or not something is designated as metallic. It's also what is going on in the normal map, how is that affecting the relief of the surface, because that's going to really affect the contours of the normals of the surface, which is going to affect the lighting as well. So to me, those three maps kind of trade off between one another. The base color map, in the PBR system, is essentially just the color. It's as if you took a polarizing filter to a texture map and just got rid of all of the lighting, all the highs and lows of it. It would just be the flat color of something. So I'll wait for a couple questions if you have them. Okay, let's see any questions being typed. So, sorry about the lags on that. I'm going to try to fix those. It kind of cuts into how sophisticated I can get with all this stuff. But again, if you have any questions about materials, if you have any questions about the PBR process, getting materials hooked up, trying to get a certain result out of a material, please let me know, and I'll get back to you. Okay? Thank you, and have a good weekend.